I went to restore my late wife's lake house and found my daughter's in-laws moving in part one. The open gate: a man can spend 40 years building a business, paying taxes, repairing roofs, and protecting his family, only to discover that someone who never contributed a single dollar has already begun dividing up his future. That is what happened to me. I drove to my late wife's lake house expecting to meet an electrician. Instead, I found my daughter's in-laws unloading furniture into the bedrooms, cooking lunch in my kitchen, and discussing where they planned to build a second dock. They had changed the name on the mailbox. They had redirected utility notices, and they were carrying boxes marked permanent lake storage. My son-in-law's father stood in the middle of my living room with a glass of bourbon and told me not to overreact. "This will belong to the children one day," he said. "We're only getting an early start." He believed family connection was the same as legal permission. By sunset, a deputy had recorded his name in a trespassing report. By the following week, an attorney had uncovered how long he had been planning the takeover. And before the summer ended, the property he expected to use for retirement had been placed behind legal protections he could never cross. My name is Raymond Mercer. I am 70 years old, and I spent 38 years operating a commercial heating and ventilation company near Columbus, Ohio. I started with one service van, a borrowed ladder, and a toolbox my father gave me when I graduated from high school. By the time I retired, Mercer Climate Systems had 42 employees, contracts across 3 counties, and a reputation I valued more than its revenue. My wife, Evelyn, used to say I could hear a failing compressor through 2 closed doors, but could not hear her asking me to take out the trash. She was usually right. Evelyn died 5 years ago after a long fight with pancreatic cancer. She was 64. We had been married for 41 years. I do not say that she lost her battle. Evelyn did not lose anything. She endured something cruel with more grace than I knew a person could possess. The disease took her life, but it never took her dignity. We had one daughter, Natalie. Natalie was 36 when this happened. She was a physical therapist, practical and compassionate, with her mother's brown eyes and my habit of checking a receipt before leaving the store. 3 years earlier, she had married Scott Delaney, a regional insurance manager. Scott was not a bad man. That distinction matters. He was intelligent, hardworking, and genuinely loved my daughter. But Scott had spent his entire life surrendering small pieces of himself to keep his father calm. His father, Frank Delaney, had the kind of confidence that often survives longer than the accomplishments supporting it. Frank had owned a sporting goods store, a landscaping business, and a boat detailing company. Each had failed. According to Frank, the bank had betrayed him, his partners had cheated him, and customers had become disloyal. His wife, Marilyn, rarely contradicted him. She had perfected the art of supporting a bad decision without appearing to participate in it. Evelyn noticed them before I did. After Natalie and Scott's wedding, she watched Frank walk around the reception hall examining the fixtures and wine selection. On the drive home, she said, "That man does not enter a room. He appraises it." I laughed then. I would remember those words later. The lake house stood on the eastern shore of Indian Lake, about 90 minutes from Columbus. Evelyn and I bought it in 2001, when Natalie was 11. It was a modest gray house with cedar shutters, a screened porch, and a narrow dock stretching into the water. The first time we saw it, rain was leaking through the roof near the fireplace. The kitchen cabinets leaned forward, and the water heater sounded like it contained a bucket of gravel. Evelyn loved it immediately. She stood by the living room window, looking across the rain-darkened lake, and said, "This place knows how to wait." Over the next 20 years, we repaired almost everything. I replaced the roof and rebuilt the dock. Evelyn refinished the cabinets and planted hydrangeas along the porch. We added a downstairs bedroom for my mother when stairs became difficult for her. Natalie learned to swim beside that dock. She celebrated 3 birthdays there, broke her wrist falling from an old rope swing, and later brought Scott there to tell us they were engaged. Above the fireplace, Evelyn hung a painted wooden sign that read, "Mercer Landing." After she died, I could barely look at it. For nearly 2 years, I visited only to check the pipes and clear storm debris. Every room seemed to contain a version of Evelyn I could no longer reach. Then grief changed. It did not disappear. It became quieter and more honest. The house stopped feeling like a wound and began feeling like proof that we had lived well together. That spring, I decided to restore it properly. The electrical panel needed updating. Several dock boards had warped. The porch screens had torn, and the lakeside steps had become too steep for anyone with weak knees. I was not planning to sell. My goal was to preserve it for Natalie and any children she and Scott might have one day. But I wanted to do that carefully. I had spent enough years in business to know that good intentions were not asset protection plans. On a Thursday morning in early June, I drove to the lake house to meet an electrician named Aaron Cole. The appointment was at 11:30. I stopped for coffee in Bellefontaine and bought 2 turkey sandwiches, thinking Aaron might stay through lunch. A folder of estimates sat on the passenger seat beside a small brass lamp that had belonged to Evelyn's mother. At 10:52, I turned onto our private lane. The chain across the entrance was hanging from one post. That was the first warning. The chain was not cut. Someone had opened it with the combination. Fresh tire marks pressed deep into the soft ground. I slowed down as the house appeared through the trees. There were 5 vehicles outside. I recognized Frank's silver Cadillac Escalade. Next to it stood a white cargo van, 2 pickup trucks, and a utility trailer backed against the porch. A mattress leaned against one truck. Several plastic storage tubs were stacked beside the front door. My green porch chairs had been moved onto the grass. Music came from inside. Someone had opened every lakeside window. Then I noticed the mailbox. The small brass plate reading Mercer was gone. In its place was a temporary white label. Delaney Family Lake House. I remained inside my truck for several seconds. At 70, you learn there is a difference between freezing and pausing. Freezing is fear taking control. Pausing is when you give your judgment time to arrive. I photographed the vehicles, trailer, mattress, boxes, open door, and altered mailbox before I stepped out. The smell of grilled meat drifted across the yard. Frank was standing at my kitchen counter when I entered. He wore a navy polo shirt and held one of my bourbon glasses. Marilyn was unpacking dishes into Evelyn's cabinets. Scott's older sister, Diane, carried folded towels toward the hallway. 2 men I did not know were moving a small dresser toward the downstairs bedroom. A little girl sat at the dining table coloring in a book. And on the screened porch, where Evelyn's wicker chair had always faced the lake, someone had placed a large television on a folding stand. Frank saw me and smiled. "Ray," he said, "you're here earlier than we expected." I looked at the dresser, then the towels, then Marilyn's hands inside my cabinet. "Expected by whom?" Frank laughed as if I had made a joke. "Scott said you were doing renovations. We thought we'd help get the place organized." "Organized for what?" "Summer use." He lifted the glass toward the window. "This is too much house for one person to leave empty. Family ought to enjoy it." I walked toward him, put down the glass. His smile tightened. "Come on, Ray. We don't need to turn this into a confrontation." This became a confrontation when you brought a mattress into my house. Marilyn closed one cabinet and opened another. "Natalie will inherit this eventually," she said. "Scott is her husband. We are not random strangers." "No," I said. "Random strangers would probably have knocked." The 2 men carrying the dresser stopped. Frank set the bourbon glass down, but his voice grew firmer. "Scott gave us the entrance combination. We have permission. Scott does not own this property. He is married to the person who will." That sentence clarified everything. This was not a weekend visit. Frank had convinced himself that my daughter's possible inheritance was already a family resource. In his mind, the only issue was timing. I removed my phone from my pocket. Frank frowned. "What are you doing?" "Calling the sheriff." Marilyn turned away from the cabinet. "Raymond, that is completely unnecessary." I met Frank's eyes as the dispatcher answered. "My name is Raymond Mercer," I said. "I am the owner of a lake property on Shoreline Pine Road. Multiple unauthorized people are inside the house. They have arrived with furniture, storage containers, and a trailer. They are moving belongings into the bedrooms and have changed the name on my mailbox. I want a deputy sent here, and I want the incident documented." The room became silent. The music continued playing for another 5 seconds before someone switched it off. Frank's face hardened. "You are calling the police on family?" "No," I said. "I am calling the police on people occupying my property without permission. Your relationship to my son-in-law will be included in the report." That was the moment the afternoon stopped belonging to Frank. Part 2. What Evelyn Built. The deputy arrived 14 minutes later. Her name was Deputy Rachel Kim. She looked to be in her early 40s and spoke in a calm, measured voice that left very little space for performance. I met her outside and showed her my driver's license, the county property record on my phone, and a copy of the deed from the folder in my truck. Frank followed us into the yard. "This is a family misunderstanding," he said. Deputy Kim looked at him. "I will speak with the property owner first." Frank tried again. "His daughter is married to my son." That does not answer a property question. There are sentences that bring oxygen into a room. That was one of them. I walked her through the house. I showed her the boxes, the mattress, the furniture being moved, the relocated porch chairs, and the temporary name on the mailbox. One of the unknown men explained that Frank had paid him to help move seasonal furniture into the family lake place. Deputy Kim wrote that down. Then we found the first piece of evidence suggesting the situation had begun before that morning. On the desk in the downstairs bedroom sat a file folder containing printed estimates for new carpeting, a boat lift installation, and an enclosed outdoor shower. Each estimate was addressed to Frank Delaney Family Lake House, Shoreline Pine Road. One estimate was dated 3 weeks earlier. Frank reached for the folder. Deputy Kim stopped him. "Please leave that where it is." His confidence changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to see it. A person looks different when his private plan becomes public evidence. Inside the same folder was a printed application to change the utility account's mailing contact. My name was still listed as the account holder, but Frank had written his own email address and phone number under Authorized Property Representative. The signature line was blank. Deputy Kim photographed every page. "Did you authorize any of this?" she asked me. "No." "Did you give Mr. Delaney permission to receive mail here?" "No." "Did you approve the moving of furniture into the residence?" "No." She turned to Frank. "Everyone who does not have written permission from Mr. Mercer needs to remove their belongings and leave the property." Frank's sister-in-law began collecting paper plates. Diane carried the towels back outside. The movers returned the dresser to the truck. Marilyn stood by the kitchen island with her arms folded. "This is humiliating," she said. I looked at Evelyn's open cabinets. "Yes," I said. "It is." Deputy Kim collected identification from every adult and recorded each license plate. She gave me an incident number and explained how to request the completed report. Before he left, Frank approached me near the driveway. He kept his voice low so the deputy would not hear. "You are going to damage Natalie's marriage over a house." I looked toward the screened porch. Evelyn's wicker chair was pushed against the wall behind the television stand. "No, Frank. You damaged the marriage when you made your son responsible for your entitlement." His jaw tightened. "You cannot keep this from family forever. This is not about keeping something from family. It is about deciding who understands how to behave. Like family." He stared at me for a moment. Then he walked to his Escalade. As the trailer pulled away, I watched the mattress disappear between the trees. Only when the lane became quiet did I return inside. The house looked disturbed in small, intimate ways. Evelyn's blue and white serving bowls had been moved. Someone had emptied the drawer where she kept handwritten recipes. Her wicker chair was facing the wall. A framed photograph of her and Natalie had been removed from the downstairs bedroom and placed on a shelf in the hall. Nothing valuable appeared stolen. That almost made it worse. They had not entered like thieves searching for money. They had entered like replacements. I called a locksmith before I called Natalie. By 3 o'clock, the door locks had been changed. The keypad had been reset. Every existing code was deleted. A new chain and weatherproof padlock secured the entrance. The locksmith also recommended a camera system that recorded both the gate and front porch. I approved it immediately. Then I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad. Did the electrician show up?" "No, but the Delaneys did." There was a pause. "What?" I asked her one question first. "Did you give Scott the gate and door combinations?" "Yes. Last winter, when you were in Florida. You asked him to check the pipes after the temperature dropped. Did you give Frank permission to use them?" "No." "Did you know he was moving furniture into the house?" "What are you talking about?" I told her everything. I did not exaggerate. Facts do not need decoration when they are already ugly. The mattress, the trailer, the contractor's estimates, the utility form, the mailbox, Deputy Kim, the report number. Natalie did not interrupt until I finished. Then she said, "Dad, I swear I knew nothing about this." "I believe you. Scott told me his parents wanted to rent a place near the lake for a few weeks. He said they might ask whether you would let them visit for a weekend. I told them they had to speak directly to you. They did not ask." "I know." Her voice broke on the last word. I heard a door open on her end. Scott, she called. Come downstairs. Now. That evening, Aaron the electrician finally arrived. His assistant had written down the wrong road, and they had spent 20 minutes driving around another section of the lake. He found me in the kitchen putting Evelyn's bowls back into the cabinet. You look like you had a day, he said. I learned someone had begun planning my retirement for me. He studied my face, decided not to ask, and inspected the electrical panel. While he worked, I moved Evelyn's wicker chair back to its place on the porch. A faded green cushion rested on the seat. She had sewn it herself. I sat there after Aaron left, watching the evening light move across the water. Grief had taught me that silence could be painful. That afternoon taught me something else. Silence could also be permission if the wrong people misunderstood it. Part 3. A misunderstanding does not require contractors. The following morning, I called my attorney, Claudia Bennett. Claudia was 73, wore dark purple glasses, and had a way of making foolish behavior sound even more foolish by describing it accurately. She had handled the sale of my company, Evelyn's estate, and several property matters over the years. I emailed her the photographs, estimates, utility form, incident number, and a written timeline. She called me 20 minutes later. Raymond, she said, how long has Frank Delaney believed he was moving into your house? I found out yesterday. That was not my question. I remained quiet. Claudia continued. People do not hire movers, request construction estimates, redirect utility communication, and print a new name for a mailbox during a spontaneous misunderstanding. He has been preparing. That was the truth I had not wanted to name. The invasion was not a moment of bad judgment. It was the visible stage of a plan. Over the next 8 days, we discovered how far that plan had developed. The contractor who prepared the outdoor shower estimate remembered Frank clearly. Frank had told him the property was transferring within the family, and that he wanted the improvements finished before he and Marilyn began spending most summers there. A boat dealer had been asked to measure the shoreline for a covered lift. A local internet provider had received an online request to establish service under Frank's name beginning July 1st. The request had not been completed because Frank could not verify ownership. My neighbor, Harold Dunn, called after seeing the security company's truck. Harold was 76 and lived 3 houses down. He spent most mornings fishing and most afternoons pretending he had not already caught enough. Ray, he said, are the Delaneys supposed to be up there? No. Well, that answers something. He told me Frank had visited twice during the previous month. On one occasion, Frank walked around the yard with a man carrying a measuring wheel. On another, he photographed the dock and porch. Harold had assumed I was considering renovations. Then he remembered something else. There was a sign in the back of Frank's vehicle, he said. I only saw part of it. Looked like painted wood. What did it say? I think it said Delaney Point. I closed my eyes. Above my fireplace hung the original Mercer Landing sign Evelyn had painted during our second summer at the house. But a smaller matching sign used to stand near the entrance. When I inspected the post, I found fresh scratches around the screws. Someone had loosened it, then apparently stopped before removing it completely. Frank had planned to rename the house before he had spent a single night there. That detail angered me more than the mattress. A mattress could be carried out. Replacing Evelyn's name for our home was an attempt to erase the life that had created it. Claudia listened as I described the sign. Then she said, we are finished treating this as an informal dispute. She prepared written notices barring Frank and Marilyn from entering the property, private lane, shoreline, dock, or any related storage structure. Copies went to Scott, Diane, and the adults identified in the deputy's report. Scott's letter was worded differently. It did not accuse him of participating in the occupation, but it clearly stated that he had no authority to distribute access codes or grant permission. Claudia also prepared an itemized demand for reimbursement, locksmith and emergency rekeying, security cameras and installation, cleaning and property inspection, replacement mailbox plate, legal preparation, repair to the entrance sign, lost appointment expenses. The total was $3,742.65. The amount would not ruin Frank. That was not the purpose. A consequence does not need to destroy someone to be effective. It only needs to be real enough that the person can no longer describe his behavior as harmless. Frank called the afternoon he received the letter. I allowed the first 2 calls to go to voicemail. On the third call, I answered. You sent me a legal bill for visiting family property. I sent you a demand for costs created by unauthorized occupation. Occupation? We were there for half a day, with a mattress, construction plans, utility applications, and a replacement name. He breathed heavily into the phone. You have made this sound criminal. I reported exactly what happened. If the description sounds criminal to you, perhaps you should consider the behavior. Natalie is your only child. Everything you own will go to her. What I leave to Natalie will be determined by my estate plan, not by your expectations. And Scott is her husband. Yes, marriage gives him responsibilities toward my daughter. It does not give you a vacation home. You think you can use a lawyer to cut us out of our own family. No, Frank. I am using a lawyer because you tried to insert yourself into my property. He lowered his voice. You are going to regret humiliating us. I looked through my kitchen window at the dogwood Evelyn planted on our 25th anniversary. People often call accountability humiliation when they expected silence. Then I ended the call. 3 days later, the new gate camera sent an alert to my phone at 8:14 in the morning. Frank's Escalade had stopped outside the chain. Marilyn sat in the passenger seat. A blue pickup waited behind them. Frank entered the old combination on the lockbox. Nothing happened. He tried again. Then he pulled hard on the chain and shouted something toward the camera. I saved the recording and called the sheriff's office. I provided the incident number and explained that a person named in the earlier report had returned despite receiving written notice. Deputy Kim was not on duty, but another deputy arrived within 20 minutes. I watched through the camera feed. Frank held up Claudia's letter as if the paper itself gave him a reason to be there. The deputy read it, pointed back toward the public road, and spoke to him for several minutes. Frank argued. The deputy remained still. Finally, Frank returned to the Escalade and reversed so quickly that his rear tire dropped into the shallow ditch. I did not celebrate, but I felt something settle inside me. A boundary is only a sentence until someone is willing to enforce it. That morning, the sentence became a gate, a camera recording, a previous report, and a deputy who already understood the history. Part 4. Scott's confession. Natalie and Scott came to my house the following Sunday. Natalie hugged me in the hallway and held on longer than usual. Scott stood behind her with dark circles beneath his eyes. I made coffee, but no one drank it. We sat at the oak table Evelyn and I had purchased when Natalie was a baby. It carried knife marks, water rings, and one small burn from a Thanksgiving candle. Scott began before I asked anything. I gave my father the codes. I know. I need to explain. You need to tell the truth. Whether it explains anything will depend on what you say. He nodded. Last December, Dad asked if he could have the lake house information in case you ever needed help. I said no. Then he asked again in February. He said he and Mom wanted to surprise you by cleaning the place before summer. Natalie looked at him. You never told me that. I know. Scott stared at his hands. He kept saying you were getting older and someone needed to take responsibility for the property. He said it would belong to Natalie eventually, and that we should start treating it like part of our future. What did you say? I asked. I told him it was not ours. And then, he kept calling. He said I was choosing my wife's father over my own family. He said Mom was hurt. He said I acted as if they were not good enough to visit. So you gave him the codes? Yes. To stop the pressure? Yes. I leaned back. Did you know about the movers? No, the mattress. No, the utility request. No, the contractors. No, the plan to rename the house Delaney Point. Scott's face changed. Natalie turned toward me. What did you just say? I explained what Harold had seen and showed them a photograph of the loosened entrance sign. Scott covered his mouth with one hand. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered. He told me he wanted to make you feel included. Natalie stared at him. Included in your father's takeover of Dad's house. I did not know. You knew enough to hide the code from me. Her voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting. Scott looked down. You're right. I had been angry with him since the moment I learned Frank had entered the property using the code. But as he sat at my table, I saw what had happened more clearly. Scott was not innocent. He had surrendered authority that was not his because enforcing a boundary with his father made him uncomfortable. But he had not planned the occupation. Frank had used his son's fear of conflict as an unlocked door. This is important, especially for anyone listening who grew up around controlling relatives. Avoiding confrontation is not always neutral. Sometimes it transfers the conflict to the person you failed to protect. Scott wanted peace with his father, so he gave away my security. The pressure stopped landing on him and began landing on me, Natalie, and our marriage as a family. What happens now? Natalie asked. First, I said, the codes remain canceled. Scott nodded. Second, neither of you gives anyone access without written permission. Understood. Third, we stop relying on what people should understand. I placed a folder on the table. Claudia and I had already begun discussing a family trust. The lake house had sentimental value, but sentiment could not protect it from divorce, debt, manipulation, or future pressure. I wanted Natalie to benefit from it after my death. I did not want ownership to become vulnerable to anyone who married into the family or claimed an expectation. Scott opened the folder. Are you removing Natalie from your estate? No, Natalie looked directly at me, wounded but composed. I am protecting what may eventually benefit her. I explained the basic structure Claudia had proposed. I would transfer the lake property into the Mercer Heritage Trust. I would retain complete control while alive. After my death, Natalie would become the primary beneficiary, but the property could not be sold, refinanced, leased long-term, renamed, or transferred without approval from an independent trustee. No spouse or in-law would receive an automatic ownership interest. No one would use the address as a legal residence without written authorization. Access codes would be personal and logged. If Natalie died before me or was unable to manage her affairs, the property would remain protected for her children or another beneficiary I selected. Scott read the summary twice. Then he said, I will sign whatever acknowledgement is necessary. Natalie looked at him. This cannot be about calming Dad down the way you calm your father down. It isn't. How do I know? Scott lifted his eyes. Because calming my father down is what created this. That was the first fully honest thing he had said all afternoon. I did not forgive him immediately. Forgiveness offered too quickly can become another way of avoiding reality. But I believed he had finally understood the cost of his decision. Part 5. Building a boundary that could survive me. Claudia arrived at my house 9 days later carrying a black leather case and 3 blue pens. She believed important signatures should always be made in blue ink because originals ought to be immediately recognizable. Natalie and Scott arrived in separate cars. I noticed but did not ask. Their marriage had been injured. It was their responsibility to decide whether they would treat the injury or merely cover it. Claudia reviewed every document in plain language. The Mercer Heritage Trust would own the lake house. I would remain trustee during my lifetime and could use, renovate, or sell the property if my circumstances genuinely required it. After my death, Natalie would receive lifetime beneficial use, subject to the trust's protections. The property could not be used to secure personal debt. It could not be included in a business venture. It could not become collateral for a spouse's loan. It could not be transferred through pressure, deception, or an informal family agreement. Any major sale would require approval from the successor trustee and a written explanation showing that the decision served the beneficiary rather than an outside party. Scott signed a separate acknowledgement stating that the lake house was Mercer family property and that neither he nor any Delaney relative held a present or future ownership interest. He had reviewed the document with his own attorney first. That mattered. A strong agreement should not depend on one person being confused or cornered. Natalie also signed rules governing future access. Then Claudia opened a second folder. This one established an education and housing fund for any grandchildren I might have one day. The fund could help with tuition, vocational training, medical needs, or a first home down payment. It would not pass directly through Frank, Marilyn, Scott, Natalie, or me once funded. A professional trustee would oversee distributions. Natalie began crying. Mom would have loved this, she said. Yes, I answered. She would have asked why I took so long. Scott smiled briefly, then wiped his eyes. Before we finished, Claudia handed me a final document. It was a permanent written prohibition against Frank and Marilyn entering the lake property without my express permission or, after my death, written trustee approval. The document referenced both sheriff's incidents, the camera recording, the utility request, the contractor estimates, and the unpaid $3,742.65 demand. Scott read it carefully. I will pay the bill, he said. Natalie turned toward him. No, I gave him the code. And you are responsible for that. But your father hired the movers, contacted the contractors, changed the mailbox, and returned after receiving notice. I want to make this right. You do not make it right by protecting him from the consequence again. Scott looked at her. She continued. He pays it. Not you. Not us. Him. The room remained quiet. Then Scott nodded. You're right. That moment told me more about their future than any apology could have. Scott had spent his life paying the emotional bills his father created. Natalie was asking him to stop. Frank had no intention of accepting the new arrangement quietly. 2 weeks later, he appeared at Natalie and Scott's home without warning. Natalie called me from their upstairs office. He says you are controlling our marriage, she said. He says Scott had no right to sign the acknowledgement. What does Scott say? He told his father to leave. Frank refuses. Are you afraid? No. I am furious. Good. Anger can provide useful information if you do not let it drive. She took a breath. Can you come here? Yes. And bring Claudia. Claudia lived closer to them than I did. She arrived in 25 minutes. I pulled into the driveway 3 minutes later. Frank stood in the living room pointing at Scott. Marilyn sat on the sofa, gripping her purse with both hands. Scott's sister Diane stood near the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Frank turned when I entered. This is your fault. Good afternoon, Frank. You have turned my son against his family. No. Your behavior forced him to decide what he would defend. Claudia stepped beside me and opened her leather case. Frank laughed without humor. More documents? Yes, Claudia said. She handed him copies of the trespass notice, the signed acknowledgement, the camera images, and the outstanding invoice. Then she gave him a formal communication directive stating that any future contact concerning the lake house, trust, inheritance, payment demand, or my estate must go through her office. Frank glanced through the pages. You cannot stop me from speaking to my own son. I am not attempting to, Claudia said. I am documenting a pattern of contact related to property over which you have no authority. Your son may choose whether he wishes to speak with you about other matters. Frank looked at Scott. You are going to let these people treat us like criminals. Scott's hands were trembling, but he did not move. You entered the house after Dad told you no. He never told me no before we went. You never asked him. We are family. You used my access code to move into a house that was not mine. I was trying to create something for all of us. You were creating something for yourself. Frank stared at him. Then he turned toward Natalie. You filled his head with this. Natalie walked down the final stair and stood beside her husband. No, she said. Your choices did. You do not understand family loyalty. I understand it better now. Loyalty does not mean handing you someone else's property, because saying no makes you angry. Marilyn finally spoke. Everyone needs to calm down. Natalie looked at her. No, Marilyn. People have been calming down for Frank his entire life. That is how we arrived here. Marilyn lowered her eyes. That was when I knew she had understood more than she admitted. Frank pointed toward Scott. Are you going to let your wife speak to your parents like this? Scott moved closer to Natalie. Yes. One word. Quiet. Difficult. Complete. Frank's expression changed as he realized the old pressure no longer worked. Claudia tapped the payment demand. The deadline is Friday at 5 o'clock. Frank looked around the room as if searching for someone who would restore the previous arrangement. No one did. He left with Marilyn and Diane. He did not slam the door. Some defeats are too final for theater. The invoice was paid 2 days later with a cashier's check. There was no apology enclosed. I did not need one. An apology offered only to recover access is not remorse. It is negotiation. Part 6. Returning the right named the remainder of the summer passed quietly. Frank and Marilyn did not return to the lake house. The cameras recorded delivery workers, deer, wind-blown branches, and one raccoon that spent 20 minutes fighting with an empty flower pot. In August, Natalie and Scott joined me for a weekend. We did not pretend nothing had happened. Pretending is not healing. It is only silence wearing fresh clothes. Scott replaced 2 warped boards on the dock. He repaired the gatepost Frank had pulled against. Natalie washed the windows and reorganized the kitchen. When she finished, she placed Evelyn's yellow ceramic pitcher in the center of the table and filled it with hydrangeas from the side yard. For a moment, the room looked exactly as it had when her mother was alive. Natalie noticed me staring. You okay? Yes, I said. Just visiting somewhere that no longer exists. She understood. That evening, Scott asked me to walk with him to the entrance. He carried a long object wrapped in brown paper. My body tightened before I knew what it was. He removed the paper. Inside was a new wooden sign. Mercer Landing. The lettering had been painted by a local artist who studied photographs of Evelyn's original work. The background was gray-blue, with a small white sailboat beneath the name. Scott held it carefully. "I know a sign does not repair what I allowed," he said. "But your wife named this place. My father tried to replace that name. I wanted to put the correct one back." I ran my thumb along the painted letters. "You did not allow everything he did." I gave him the door. "Yes. I thought keeping him happy would keep everyone peaceful. And what did you learn? That peace requiring someone else to surrender is not peace." I handed him the drill. We attached the sign together. Natalie stood behind us near the gate, watching. When the final screw went in, I stepped back. The sign was not Evelyn's original, but it honored what she had created. There is a difference between replacing a memory and protecting it. Scott had finally learned that difference. The three of us ate dinner on the screen porch that night. Natalie asked questions about her mother's first summer at the house. Scott listened without interrupting. Later, he apologized again. This time, he did not ask me to reassure him afterward. That mattered. Real accountability does not demand that the injured person immediately relieve the offender's discomfort. Natalie and Scott remained married. Their relationship did not become perfect. Perfect marriages exist mainly in anniversary speeches and lies. But their marriage became more honest. Scott began counseling to understand why he found it so difficult to refuse his father. He stopped answering calls designed to manufacture emergencies. He and Natalie agreed that neither set of parents would receive house keys, financial access, or private information without mutual consent. Frank responded by calling Scott ungrateful. Then, when that failed, he stopped calling for several months. A boundary often feels like cruelty to someone who benefited from its absence. That does not make the boundary cruel. The Mercer Heritage Trust was completed in September. The lake house deed was properly transferred, insured, and recorded. Claudia kept certified copies. I kept another set in my home safe. Every access code was individual. Every entry was logged. No one could borrow against the house, rename it, claim residency, or treat an expected inheritance as present ownership. I also prepared a written property use guide. Some people might consider that excessive. Those people have probably never found a mattress being carried into their dead wife's bedroom. The guide explained who could use the house, how permission would be granted, which expenses guests were responsible for, and what actions would result in immediate loss of access. Clarity is not hostility. It is one of the most useful forms of kindness because it removes the space where manipulation grows. Part 7. The house that knew how to wait. I returned to Mercer Landing alone in late October. The summer boats were gone. The air smelled of damp leaves, wood smoke, and cold water. I unlocked the gate and heard the chain fall against the post with a solid metallic sound. Inside the house, everything was still. Evelyn's wicker chair faced the lake. The yellow pitcher sat on the kitchen table. The new sign stood at the entrance where it belonged. I made coffee and carried it to the screened porch. The morning was too cold to remain there long, but I sat anyway. 5 years earlier, I had believed protecting Evelyn's memory meant leaving everything untouched. I was wrong. A house cannot survive on memory alone. Roofs fail. Wood rots. Locks become outdated. People make assumptions. Weak documents invite strong personalities to fill in the gaps. Preservation requires action. That lesson applies to more than property. If you want to protect your family, speak clearly before a crisis. Do not assume your children understand your estate plan. Do not assume a verbal promise will survive. Grief, divorce, debt, or a persuasive relative. Do not share unrestricted access codes simply because someone is connected to you by marriage. Keep accurate ownership records. Review beneficiary designations. Document valuable property. Consider whether a trust, transfer restriction, or independent trustee is appropriate for your circumstances. And seek advice from a qualified local attorney rather than copying a form from the internet. Laws differ, families differ, and a poorly drafted document can create the exact conflict you hope to prevent. Most importantly, learn the difference between generosity and surrender. Generosity is a choice made freely. Surrender is what happens when someone turns your love, age, grief, or fear of conflict into leverage. Frank did not begin by breaking a window. He began by asking his son for a code. He wrapped entitlement in the language of family. He treated future possibility as present permission. He counted on Scott's discomfort, Natalie's loyalty, and my desire to avoid drama. But there is nothing peaceful about allowing someone to practice taking what belongs to you. Claudia had called Frank's actions a rehearsal. She was right. The contractor's utility request, mailbox label, mattress, and replacement sign were not isolated mistakes. They were small tests. Frank wanted to know which claim I would challenge and which one I would accept to keep the family comfortable. The answer became all of them. I challenged all of them. Not with threats, not with violence, not with revenge. With photographs, property records, a sheriff's report, changed locks, written notices, cameras, legal counsel, and a trust designed to outlive me. Frank believed my age made me easier to move around. He confused quiet with weakness. He confused inheritance with ownership. And he confused his son's willingness to surrender with my willingness to do the same. He was wrong every time. As I sat in Evelyn's chair, the lake darkened under a passing cloud. I thought about the first day we saw the house. The roof had leaked, the kitchen cabinets had tilted, and Evelyn had stood beside the window smiling. "This place knows how to wait," she had said. She was right. The house had waited through years of work, through Natalie's childhood, through Evelyn's illness, through my grief, and through one man's attempt to claim a future he had not earned. Now it was waiting for something better. Maybe grandchildren. Maybe long summer weekends with Natalie. Maybe mornings when Scott and I repaired the dock without needing to discuss his father. Maybe only me, sitting with coffee and remembering the woman who saw a home inside a damaged building. Whatever came next would arrive by invitation. That was the difference. A key can open a lock. A family connection can open a conversation. But neither creates ownership. Respect does. Permission does. Responsibility does. And when those things are missing, a documented boundary can close a door more firmly than anger ever will. Frank Delaney thought he was moving into my late wife's lake house. Instead, he gave me the warning I needed to protect it permanently. He lost access to the property, paid for the damage he caused, and watched his son finally stand beside his wife instead of behind his father. The mailbox says Mercer again. The entrance sign carries Evelyn's chosen name. The dock remains beneath my feet. And the house still belongs to the life that built it, not to the person who arrived with the largest trailer. Conclusion: if someone is pressuring you to surrender access, money, property, or authority in the name of family, pause before you agree. Ask what they are truly requesting. Ask whether you have the legal right to give it. Ask why your hesitation makes them angry. Healthy relatives may be disappointed by a boundary, but they can respect it. Manipulative people treat every boundary as betrayal because unrestricted access was always their real objective. Do not wait until resentment becomes evidence. Put important agreements in writing. Protect sentimental property with the same seriousness you would protect financial assets. Explain your intentions clearly and update your plans when circumstances change. Forgiveness may repair a relationship, but accountability is what makes that repair safe. I forgave Scott because he admitted what he had done, accepted the consequence, changed his behavior, and stopped asking other people to absorb his father's pressure. I did not restore access to Frank because he did none of those things. Both decisions came from love. One preserved a relationship. The other preserved a boundary. You are allowed to do both. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. What would you have done after finding your daughter's in-laws moving into your late wife's lake house? Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear that protecting what they built is not selfish. Family should be welcomed through the door. It should never assume ownership of the house.